Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for FMT's presentation of GP Year-End Close Training. My name is Lucas Darling. I'm an account executive here at FMT Consultants, and I'm joined by one of our very own senior GP consultants, Darian Tessure, and he'll be guiding you through the webinar today. For those of you who aren't familiar with FMT, I'd like to just take a few moments to give you a brief introduction of our company. Here at FMT, we opened up for business in 1995 out of Carlsbad, California, and have successfully completed over 1,000 ERP projects and have accumulated over 120 ERP clients spanning the US and even into Canada. During this time, we have been able to establish ourselves as Southern California's leading provider of integrated solutions, and along with our 22 years of experience, our team possesses the functional and technical knowledge in all areas of an ERP solution. And with the seamless transition to our customer care team, we're dedicated to the success of your company. We are a Microsoft Gold partner as well as a preferred partner for both Dell and NetSuite. We've been partnered with Microsoft for over 20 years and consult on a wide range of Microsoft products. We have 6 Gold competencies with Microsoft as well as a Tier 1 cloud service provider. Because of our expertise in the space, we were approached by both NetSuite and Dell to engage in a strategic partnership and have enjoyed that partnership for years and will enjoy it for years to come. Now, the FMT way is really something you begin to understand once you engage and begin doing work with us. With the combination of talent, experience, and methodology, we're fully dedicated to the success of your company. We offer a wide array of services pertaining to ERP, CRM, SharePoint, BI and Analytics, and even Office 365. In addition to our offerings, we have an entire department dedicated specifically to customer support with 13 full-time senior consultants serving you from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. One of the things that FMT really prides ourselves on is having those extremely experienced consultants. They're versed in all kinds of backgrounds, industries, systems, solutions. So we really understand your struggles, and we want to put you in a position to succeed and hit your goals. Now I'm going to hand it over to Darian, but before I do, I wanted to point out that our GP Year-End Manual is available for download in the handout section of the GoToMeeting. And if at any point during the presentation you have a question, feel free to type them into the comment box. We will be monitoring it during the entire presentation, and we will answer them at the end. Thank you. Darian?
Great. Thanks, Lucas. Good day, everyone. Thank you for attending the Dynamics GP FMT Consultants Dynamics GP Year-End Close Manual and session. So as you can see on the screen, the agenda for today will be we've already gone through the introduction, so we'll start with what we're here for today, the year-end close. We'll obviously talk about preparing for year-end, and then we'll go through all the modules and the orders that you would do the year-end process in, which is right there on the screen: inventory, receivables and sales, payables and purchasing, fixed assets, general ledger, and payroll is kind of a misnomer. You can actually do that whenever you like, but we just talk about it at the end. But again, preferably it can be done on its own anytime, but you would probably still do general ledger last. And then if we have any Q&A at the end of the session, which I believe we will have time, then certainly feel free to ask questions to us at that time. All right, so we just want to go through some general preparation here, year-end best practices. If you haven't done a year-end in Dynamics GP before, it is not a complicated process. It's more about the timing and just following the procedure in a methodical fashion, as well as making sure that you have access to the ability to back up the databases several times throughout the year-end process. So as the points on the screen indicate, backing up the system and company databases, system being like the Dynamics database, and then your company databases. That is key to year-end because if anything happens during a year-end process, it's a finite process. You can't roll it back if you don't most often restore. So that's why we suggest following our manual and saying at those steps when it says to create the backups at this time, then go ahead and do so. If you don't have access to the ability to back up your systems, you want to coordinate this with your IT team. So you may want to have a strategy in place for doing that, and you probably want to do your year-end process at times when you don't want to have other processes going on at the same time. Okay, other items of note here are SQL maintenance, and also that includes areas like data integrity, which we call check links. So again, highly recommend backups when you run through these. You don't know the outcome of when you do data integrity checks in the system, so it's always, again, they're irreversible processes, so having backups of your database before those occur in case you have unwanted results, then you can go back and look at it again before, if needed to, and restore it. The fiscal period setup, so sorry, and then using checklists. So, Dynamics GP has checklist sections in the system itself under routines. So if you want to use those, you can, and you can add windows from GP. You can add external shortcuts like as links to the internet, or you can use external applications to open, and you can even use macros from Dynamics GP. And if you're not familiar with any of those, then come talk to us afterwards and we can walk you through how those work. But all of those items are useful, and the checklists in GP are good to have because once you set them, then they're always there, and you can use that process over and over every time you do a year end, and of course month end and daily procedures. All those checklists are there if you want to use them accordingly. The fiscal period setup now, obviously this is key because you're going to close periods and you're going to create fiscal periods and fiscal new year. So be familiar with that section. And if you want to be super cautious with your year end, you can restore your production database to test, and you can run through those processes until you get to the general ledger in case things get affected there. But up to that point, all the sub-ledgers are fine in the test database. And you can also run through it in that methodology as well. But when you're creating and closing fiscal periods, that's really important. Those are key steps in the Dynamics GP year-end process. Be familiar with the acronyms that we use. So we use things like MDGP in the manual, which is Microsoft Dynamics GP, and other acronyms accordingly that match up maybe module names like SOP, which is Sales Order Processing, and POP, which is Purchase Order Processing, etc. So just be aware of those if you see them in our manual. If you're not familiar with what they are, then just reach out to us or check it out if you're not sure. Printing is kind of key in year end. So if you don't want to print everything out, hard paper, we don't want to kill the environment and be mindful of that. GP does have an excellent feature that lets you print to the file. And when you do that, you can also have it so it appends the file so that if you're doing the process to the same file over and over, then it can add those items. Most often you want to use replace with new names, but just be aware of that. You can go back and look at them later using a tab delimited format is the best with Excel. Okay, so moving on to the next slide here. Again, just to reiterate, this is the order that you want to close your modules in Dynamics GP. So be very familiar with this process. It's very key, and certain things occur at certain times that update other modules, and that is why it is recommended you follow this order. So you have sales, which is Sales Order Processing in GP, and receivables, followed by the Purchase Order Processing or Purchasing and Payables, and then inventory. If you have project accounting and fixed assets, then they are next, and then payroll, and then finally general ledger. Okay, so let's talk about sales and receivables. So note that a lot of the manual covers also period end procedures. They start on page 24 of our manual. So you do want to do that obviously at the end of the year, that process. And you want to do that every month, of course. So, that process includes performing your aging routine. If you use the reconcile feature to reconcile your subledger to GL, then that feature is there. If you're using finance charges, and I find that's more the exception than the norm, okay, so then you can perform that process. And then finally, you want to perform your statements. And then once you've done that, say if you're in a calendar year end, obviously the end of December, or year 12 of whatever period your year end is in, then the next step you want to do is to go to the year end process in our manual, which is on page 67. Okay, so if you only have the financials, you don't have the distribution modules, you want to make sure that you close the receivables module before the general ledger. Other points to note here is that, sorry, and then, excuse me, there's also 2 more routines in the monthly routine I omitted, which is if you use them again, this is more the exception than the norm, but there's commissions. And then finally, the paid transaction removal. So if you're not familiar with these steps, I highly recommend that you reach out to us or myself or understand what those mean. Paid transaction removal is kind of a really key feature. A lot of people don't really understand what its purpose is, but in receivables, if you're used to payables, you'll notice that items move from open status to history status automatically, and that occurs when you use the apply payables documents feature window and you actually apply documents in full. And in terms of credits, payments, and returns. So if you actually apply those in full to an invoice, for example, or a debit memo, those documents, once they're applied in full on both sides, they move to history automatically. In receivables, it doesn't do that automatically because there's a routine called statements. If people want to see, if you want to show your customers like the invoice and that they've been issued plus the payment that they've made, then in Dynamics GP, you need to leave that process in the open status so that they can see that in their statements. Paid transaction removal is like the automated feature in Payables that once it's fully applied and you don't want those on your statements anymore, you don't want to see them in the open status of GP, then you can move them to the history status. You need to be careful here though, because once you move a receivables or sales transaction into the history status, then you cannot perform voids on those transactions, or say a check that you received didn't clear, then you can't reverse that either. So the paid transaction removal, what we recommend is when you log into GP for the first time, set your system date to about 2 to 3 months earlier than your month end. So if it's like December 31st today and you're doing your month end, then set paid transaction removal, anywhere between 30 and 90 days before, depending on how long you believe you'll have voids to process in your quarterly routine, month and quarterly routines that you're used to. I tell most of my clients 60 to 90 days. So if you're doing month end on December 31st, I tell them to leave it open, as of October 31st or September 30th. So that way they only have 190 to 120 days open that they can still do voids. But once they set that and then they run the paid transaction removal routine, when you set the system date in GP first when you log in, and then you perform that routine, then all of the transactions occur on that date. So for example, if it's December 31st, you set your system date in Dynamics GP in the bottom left corner. You click on that date and open it up and change it to October 31st. And then you go into the routine for sales, paid transaction removal. All the dates are preset. Items that don't have dates next to them actually pick the system date that they use to run. And that is why I say do that first. And then it will go ahead and perform all the the documents that are fully applied to each other, they will move to history as of that date or earlier. If you do not perform that routine, then your open status or open transactions will grow immensely, and it will slow down processes in GP, such as when you're looking up invoices and things like this, doing inquiries. So it's a very good habit to do that routine every month. Okay, and then on page 54, you're going to go through the receivables management close routine. And then if you perform the process, and this is kind of tricky too. So there's a part in there in the receivables, and this can actually occur in every module that I talk about. So kind of keep note on this. The calendar year end. So sometimes if the calendar year end, they don't need to be run, but if you do run them, all that information that you see in GP, that when you do inquiries and you look at stats such as customer yearly amounts and things like this, that is driven by that the year end in receivables. So, you know, we always say you have time to do some of these, but it's very good practice to try and do all of your sub-ledger closings as close to when year end occurred and before you start processing in GP, if you can. Obviously, that's sometimes very difficult, and if statistics aren't really a concern for you, then those areas are not that important to concern yourself with. Another important point to note is the tax year end. So don't close this if you're using payables and using tax and you have using those in payables or purchase order, you'll perform that routine there. So just keep that in mind if you've never been through that before, or if you wondered why things were kind of strange if you did do that as per the manual, then this is what we recommend. Again, a pretty straightforward routine for month-end close, nothing too sophisticated. So that concludes the discussion on the receivables close for year-end. All right, now we move on to the payables management close, very similar to receivables. However, there are some key points in here, as you can see on the slide deck. You know, before you start any year-end, even before anything, you want to make sure tax updates are applied. Tax updates come out often. So if you're on a calendar year-end, you want to pay very close attention to those tax dates. GP tries to do as much as they can, and tax dates haven't really changed this year. So I think everyone should be pretty safe in this area. But do ensure that you check back often, especially if you're doing this in January, to make sure they haven't done an update on you since you did your last update, say in December. Some routines to note here. Again, in purchase orders, if you notice that, you know, it's a common routine to go through the remove completed purchase orders, which is more of a monthly routine than a year end, but some people leave it to year end as well. So note that that routine is what moves your purchase orders to the history table. And again, like receivables, there are some caveats to that. If once you move purchase orders to history, you cannot perform returns on those transactions. So most people would leave that open, at least again, like receivables, like a quarter, or they judge how long it takes for them to do routines. If they think they might have returns throughout the year, they'll leave it for a year-end function. But again, that process is usually a quarterly function. So again, I tell clients to at least keep it open, you know, 3 months minimum. And you want to follow that routine and do it, because if you're finding, like when you open up purchase orders, it takes longer, or when you're doing inquiries and searches on purchase orders, this is why, because everything is in the open table for GP, and all of that is your open POs that are sitting there, and they don't move to history until you run this routine. Okay, and again, the tax update is important because if you're running 1099s or 1096s, the tax update affects those, and you also need to consider this if you're using payroll as well. So be very mindful of the coordination of those forms between payroll and payables. They usually try to sync those together as much as possible. Again, the month-end routine for payables is on page 36 of the manual, and the year-end process starts on page 57. Okay, and then If you have taxes in GP, this is where you will run the tax close for the year that you didn't do if you have receivables also. Okay, and then again, you go through the routine of closing the calendar year, and as you can see, it moves balances and updates statistics, and the same with the fiscal year end as well. There's also a routine for reconciling 1099 amounts for the calendar year, but be very careful. If you manually adjust anything in GP, you don't want to touch that routine because that will update any manual change you've done. It will clear those out. So do not run that routine until you finish your 1099 process. And that next year, especially for clients who have come into GP mid-year or didn't start the 1099 process until mid-year, anything like that, then you're manually updating your 1099 information. You don't want to run that routine. If you're doing 1099s year to year, then you can go ahead and do that. And again, there will be warnings in the manual about doing backups before performing all these functions, etc. You can also, then this is the time to run the 1099s themselves when they're ready. And of course, you can run an edit list that's described on page 61, so you're not closing the 1099s, or you can review them before you actually put them on the forms. And the key things here are looking for the numbers, of course, to be accurate, as well as ensuring that the right 1099 vendor address ID is being called up when you run those reports. And then for those people who aren't aware of this and they have older versions of GP, the 1096 form actually didn't come out until GP 2013 R2. So just keep that in mind if you're looking for that and you don't see it and you have an older version than 2013 R2, this is why. And then, of course, you perform the fiscal year end as we go. And that's pretty much it for the payables close. And there's not too much more I need to mention there from tips, etc. All right. Then we have the inventory close. So if you don't have inventory, you can just take a break for a few minutes in the presentation. And then you will see here that this starts on page 10 for the month-end processes, for the month-end procedure, sorry, and then the fiscal year close starts on page 50. Okay, obviously, key points here are make sure all your transactions are posted for the year. Make sure nothing is open. You can check this through the series, routine, and batches for inventory, or through master posting, which can look at all modules. And then you want to perform reconcile processes in GP before you perform, as part of your year-end process, and ensure that when you do reconcile, you start with sales order processing first, then purchase order processing, and then inventory. It's very key you do all those items in that order because transactions and sales are updating costs if something's is amiss there. So that will update the inventory table, and also purchasing, any changes there will also affect inventory. So you want to make sure that they're followed in that order specifically. That would be the point on the screen that talks about reconcile inventory quantities. Next, you want to do a physical inventory count. So if you're new to GP and you have, say, more than 100 to 500 items, you can use the Dynamics GP stock count routine. It's very detailed. So, my experience is if you have a lot of inventory, there are other ways to do the stock counts rather than that process. That process can become very tedious and cannot update very quickly. There's a lot of manual updates that occur, nothing automatic. So, I recommend that you could print out the sheets and do your tallies, but you may want to use like an import routine to do inventory adjustments rather than use the stock count routine. So just keep that in mind if you're new to GP and you're using that routine. If it's more than like 1,000 items or more, I wouldn't recommend using that routine. It can really slow you down at the during that process. If you are using that routine, though, there is a stock count schedule for year end. You can use it. You can mass add your sites to ensure that all items are on the sites as necessary. Then you go through the stock count procedure. You can have it auto post, which is a very handy feature that they added so that you're not doing that manually. It just does it automatically. And then there's a variance smart list on the manual on page 20 that you can use to look at the inventory changes. And that is very useful whether you're using this process or not. And then if you're using this process, it's the reconcile GL feature is there. And again, this would be using your subledger control inventory accounts to reconcile to the GL control accounts there. So whatever your inventory account or accounts are for controls, this is where you put them in this spreadsheet function, or sorry, this procedure, and then it creates a spreadsheet to look at all the transactions from a matching and reconciling feature. If you haven't used that feature before, I recommend trialing in the test company to see how it operates. Sometimes if you're new to it, it can be confusing, but what it's doing is it's trying to show you all the transactions that are matched versus the ones that aren't matched, so that hopefully you don't have that many that are unmatched that you can go review and find out why GP believes that they're not matching between the subledger and the GL. But that is a very handy routine that people didn't have before that people are asking for Dynamics GP to do. So if you haven't used that feature, not familiar with it, I highly recommend you take a look at it and see if it has some value to you. And then finally, you're doing the inventory year end. So, you're following those processes on the screen there. Close the year, only the fiscal, what happens, all the summary, quantities go to last year. So again, your statistics are updated, updates beginning quantities, zeros out quantities sold, and again, it has the option for you to remove discontinued items at this time if you like. And that pretty much sums it up for the inventory module for year-end close. Let me just check here. So we don't talk about it in a slide here, but if you do have project accounting, we can go over some points about it. So if you're not familiar with the year-end process in project accounting, there's really only 3 main points that we have, and these are all in the manual as well. You want to make sure that you post all your cost transactions. You want to run all your final billings and revenue recognition on projects for the year. And this routine is done because then it makes sure that the GL is updated before you run year end. Okay, and it'll also speed up the reconcile process. And then if you use position rate tables, then you want to update those tables, both there and the employee rate table maintenance windows. Next, we move on to fixed assets. So again, the month-end process for fixed assets starts on page 40, and then the year-end process starts on page 67. Okay, so just like month-end routine, you want to make sure all the depreciation is run through, for all of your assets right for the whole fiscal year. And then you want to make sure that payables is closed, and you want to do this routine before GL. Okay, a GL posting routine, that is not general ledger in the GL. Obviously, those use fixed assets. This is the GL posting routine in fixed assets. So you want to make sure all that is run so nothing is outstanding in terms of transactions that need to be processed for the year. Really key point, you run all the year-end reports. Make sure you run things like the depreciation report and ensure that you save that. If you have an older version, then yes, you want to definitely save that because you can't print at a later date. But for anything, and most people should be hiring GP 2010, then you can actually not worry about that and you'll be fine. But I always recommend anyways running all those reports and saving them anyways as a good habit to file, etc. Okay, and then you want to make sure now that you run the year-end process. So you perform the year-end close. What happens here again is it clears out year-to-date maintenance and depreciation. The cost base is copied to begin year costs. Life-to-date is updated. And if you have any salvage values, then that is moved as well. And again, I always recommend that, again, use test companies, backups, run these through, make sure you're happy with the results you get at every module year-end close before you move on to the production year-end close. It's always very handy to go through that routine and saves you a lot of headache in case any gotchas come up. Okay, I'm actually going to kind of skip slides. I want to go to payroll first because we always do GL last. So I'm going to just jump ahead and then I'll come back one just to make sure we've covered this. So payroll, for those of you who aren't using payroll, then you get a little break here for a few minutes. But you want to make sure that the month-end procedures you follow are on page 80 of the manual. And the I think this is in reverse actually, and the year ends run on page 80. I think the month ends are page 48. You want to install all of your updates, obviously, before you finish the year end. And then obviously you want to complete all your pay runs for the current year as well. And again, it's probably a good idea to install the updates that come out in December and then not finish off payroll until maybe mid-January, third week. That can be a bit stressful, but that ensures that there are no emergency updates that come out. I think this year, again, this was a good year. I remember seeing the updates from GP saying that they didn't anticipate it. The government really didn't have any changes there, so everything was fine. Okay, you want to do things like create the wage file, the year-end wage file. Again, back up before and after this and save those files. Okay, you want to verify all of your forms that you're going to print next, W-2s, 1099-R, etc. So verify, print, and then your federal returns too. Note that for federal, I think it's called EFW Z or Z, that no 1099-R, SUDA, or state forms are in GP. And there's an ISV called Green Shades that you can look at for that processing those year-end forms if you need to. Again, you're going to install a tax update. Okay, so that's the one I mean that you're going to want to check often and make sure that, and then that's pretty much it for payroll. And again, this is one of those modules where you're going to make a lot of backups and run it because, you know, anything can happen there and you may miss something. So I highly recommend test company, run through the process a few times, make sure everything works the way you want before you go to the next, do it in production. So that's all I want to say about payroll. Finally, we have the general ledger. So you survived getting all the sub ledgers done. Good for you. Now your final year end is the GL. So really key point here from the GL, obviously, are all the month end routines. So you finish all those on page 47, and it's not very deep for month end year GL routines. Mainly around your fiscal calendars and everything else is done, the subledgers first before you do this. So that's the same, and year end again the same. So month ends on page 47 and year ends on page 73. You want to make sure that when you start year end that you check the posting types. If you're new to GP and you don't know what this means, once you've run through year end and you didn't look at this, then you'll know exactly what this is about. So posting types in GP decide whether your accounts are balance sheet or profit and loss. So they have huge effects at the end of the year when you run year end. So obviously if you pick a balance sheet account and it's a profit and loss, then it wouldn't have zeroed out and you need to go back and fix this. And the same if you had a P&L account, or sorry, you had a balance sheet account that was marked as a P&L, then obviously it gets zeroed out and that's not the result you want going forward either. So that routine there, and you can use SmartList, just go into, financial and pull up accounts, pull up that column, and you can review it. It's very straightforward. You can tell it if you have accounts in a natural string for revenue, you can have the search set to just pull up all the balance sheet accounts, and then have a search routine that says bring me up any accounts that range that say post and type profit and loss. Very handy to get those exceptions out, and then the reverse for the other way. Once you got that sorted, then you want to print a summary trial balance to review how it's looking. Okay. Then you want to print all your financial statements from Management Reporter. Okay, or any other reporting tool that you're using, BI 360, etc. Then you begin to get the fiscal periods created for the new year. So you create the new year in GP. And then once you create that new year, you perform if you do any processing in January, you'll notice that if you look at it in your inquiry windows, sometimes they're out of balance, or if you run any type of report, it will be out of balance most likely until you run this year-end process, because the GP beginning balance hasn't been updated yet. So for the beginning year, so then it doesn't give you the information when you look at summary windows, inquiries, or run reports. So you need to be mindful of that. Okay, and then you want to close all the fiscal periods. So again, you'll close hopefully all your subledgers are closed out. Then you close out your general ledger. Okay, and then you're closing out the fiscal periods for the financial year once the year end has been processed. Something I want to say too before you run year end is make sure you go to the setup window of GP and you check your retained earnings account that is set the way you want. And if you are actually going to have retained earnings break up by divisions, that is set correctly as well. And if you're using the divisions choice, then make sure all of your retained earnings for every division natural segment is set up. So that is very important, or you will have errors after it's run. Okay, and then when you run the year-end routine, there's a progress bar. And if you're on 2013 R2 or earlier, you need to absolutely 1,000% make sure you've done backups, because once you run year-end, you cannot reverse that process. From 2013 R2 and later, there is a reverse historical year button now, and it's very handy. It actually is a very seamless process. Again, backups are still the safety net here, even for people who have this option. But I've performed reversals for clients using that button, and it's a very seamless process, and everything goes back the way it should. If you need to do that function, that is available now to do that. Options during your close year end, obviously there's a progress bar so you can see what's happening. If you want to maintain inactive accounts, then you want to have this marked. If you don't mark it, then any inactive accounts with zero balance and no transactions, they will be removed from the system. And if you want that to occur, that's what you want to do. Okay, and make sure that before you run your end too, that the posting to history You may, if after year-end, sorry, and you want to make adjustments, make sure that option is on, or otherwise you can't do it. But that option allows you to do that function. And then, of course, close all fiscal periods, as it says on the last step here. And that will, obviously, when you run the year-end in GL, it's closing all the P&L accounts to retain earnings, marks that year as historical. And remember in GP that once you mark a year as historical, you can only post transactions for the previous year only, not the year before that. So anything, so say that your calendar year is your year end, December 2017, so you do year end for 2017, 2016 and earlier, you'll not be able to post to unless you reverse the year and need to do that. All right, so it concludes the presentation for today on Dynamics GP year-end close. I will now leave this open for questions, if there are any. Over to you, Alice.
Nope, doesn't look like there's any questions, Darian. Thank you everybody for joining us today. If you guys come up with any other questions, we will be following up with all the attendees, so feel free to ask at that time. We truly do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us, and we hope to see you at all our future events, and have a great day.